via my laptop instead of my phone. So be more presentable that way.
And I think we'll. Should we start, and then if people come in, they come in? Are you still having?
That was the plan. 5 minutes after is the time. So we'll begin. Welcome to the AHLJ's discussion with Abraham Hamra and Robert Garson. It's called Brown Jews and Jews with a Hue. So this is really going to be a, I think, pretty candid, off the cuff discussion between Rob and Abraham. And I'd also like to introduce Richard Fulton. He is the AHLJ's new executive director, and we are extremely excited to have him. Richard, if you wanted to say a few words.
Very few words. I don't want to divert from the main presentation, but I'm really thrilled to be joining AHLJ as its executive director. I think this is really the AHLJ's moment. We are at a time of profound concern, both for the Jewish community generally, but especially for American Jewish lawyers, the concerns that we are dealing with in terms of threats to Jews, both verbally and physically, in terms of the legal questions of free speech versus safety of our community, both of which we take very seriously, and many other issues. So I'm very much looking forward to taking on this role at AHLJ, working closely with Rob and with Alyssa and all of the rest of the team in responding to these concerns, and with that, I'll finish and look forward to being able to address all of you at length at some other time.
Very nice to meet you. Right.
Good to meet you.
Thank you, Richard. So Rob and Abraham, I don't know if you want a further introduction or if you want to just get to it. Apologies, I didn't prepare something more formal.
That's okay. I think we'll kind of get to it. For those that don't know, and they should know, since the atrocities of October 7th, Abraham Hamra has become one of the most forceful voices in, I would say, not just the Jewish, Israeli, but also Arab world on what transpired, what is going on, what the views are on the ground, actually putting forward what is the brown Jewish narrative. Because one thing that we've been all appalled about over the last few months is seeing this new theory that's being perpetrated that Israel's colonization, so to speak, first that it's a colonization, and secondly, that it was a white colonization. Certainly those of us that I have here, the quintessential brown Jew, and myself a Jew with a hue, would fundamentally disagree with. And that's something that we're going to be talking about over the course of today. You'll hear from Abraham, and you'll understand why his voice has risen to really such prominence in a medium that many of us lawyers don't necessarily live in. So, Abraham, sabah al-khair.
Sabah al-khair, my fellow Sabah al-khair, my fellow Jew with a hue. I wish I can say it with an accent. I can't, but I'll leave that to you. I gotta say, my chest hair is showing much more than yours, so I think the Sephardi Mizrahi is a little bit more in me. I think there's some milk dropped into you.
Well, it's actually my wife told me to do mine up, and I said, she said it makes you look less professional. But I thought for us, we had to show a little bit of character.
Yeah.
Abraham, why didn't you tell everybody here your personal story? Because it's not that story that you, like myself, were both immigrants to the United States, and I think would say grateful immigrants to the United States. but your story is particularly compelling, and I would like, if you could, to take a few minutes to share it.
Sure. Before I say my story, I think it's important to just kind of trace back to understand the most hated word today, the context of my story and the context in which I was born into. Prior to 1946, prior to Israel being created, this entire region was one big caliphate. So the idea of Syria as a sovereign state was a 1946 invention. When 47-48 happened, there was a lot of people from Syria, a lot of Jewish people, for instance, my grandmother's mother, who decided to move to Israel. They went to Israel, they went back to Syria to collect some stuff, and they were trapped in Syria because of the outbreak of the 1948 war, in which Syria and other Arab countries joined to attack Israel. Many of the Jews around the Arab countries were expelled with this idea of riots and mobs and this anti-Zionistic anti-Semitism. And the ones that remained, particularly in Syria, were looked at as political hostages, as pawns that can be used against Israel. And so I was born in the midst of that conflict. I was born into political hostage status. In 1987, I was born in Damascus, Syria. And at the time, Jews were not allowed to leave the country. And so we lived predominantly in the Jewish quarters. Some started moving out into the city of Damascus, but that didn't happen until the 90s. We couldn't leave the country. We couldn't immigrate as a family unit out of the country. So my dad was a tailor. Sure.
What was the status of Jews generally before political hostage within the Arab country? Did it have full citizenship prior to that or not?
So no, the status of a Jew in that area of the region, in that part of the world, we were considered as dhimmis, and that's true for Jews and Christians that were living in that region. And the idea of a dhimmi is supposed to be a protected person. This idea came out of a battle of Khaybar, which you hear a lot in the streets, like, we want Khaybar back. Khaybar was a battle, one of the first battles that Muhammad had, in which he conquered a town named Khaybar. The residents of that town were all Jewish. Is a treaty as a part of their surrender. They had to agree to certain things, such as paying extra taxes, jizya, having restrictions in what they do, how they practice their faith. And as long as they accepted those, they were considered dhimmis and protected from violence. Now, many leaders never actually took the protection portion of dhimmi to heart, but we lived as such, based on that theory, since the expansion of the Islamic conquest of the, I think, 4th century, 3rd century.
So you were brought up there. How, we know that many, the funny thing is, Syrian Jews on the whole didn't come to Britain. They mainly went to Israel and mainly went to America. So even when I came to the United States, people said, "Oh, you're Sephardi, you must be Syrian." It was a crazy question. I said, "Who's Syrian?" Then I made a Hajj to Brooklyn, and I met all the Syrians there. But many of them left a lot earlier. And so one of the questions I was going to ask you, why didn't your family leave earlier? You came to the United States in the 90s.
Yes. So prior to 1990, prior to 1992, you couldn't immigrate as a family unit out. So I was expanding on that a little earlier, where if my dad, for instance, he was a tailor, he used to sell clothing to Poland, and so he had to take trips out of Syria. When he had to leave the country, he would collect our passports and give it to a special police force that was in charge of the Jewish community. And they were called the Mukhabbarat. They were supposed to give you protection. They ended up spying on us, just calling us Zionists, you're collaborating with Israel, arresting hundreds of Syrian men. They made our life a living hell in Syria. So they would get our passports, and then they would routinely check in on our family to make sure we didn't escape or try to run away because our father left. In 1992 was the first time the U.S. reached a treaty with Syria to release its Jews. The first wave of Jews left. My grandparents on my mother's side were were part of that first wave. And I was telling you, I remember very distinctly, in 1993, Assad changes his mind. You know what? No longer. No longer are we going to allow more Jews to immigrate out of Syria.
So but your grandparents had left.
My grandparents had left a huge portion of the remaining 5,000 Jews that remained after 48 as political hostages. A significant portion is left. So the people that were left over in 93 were beyond, just in complete ruins because they didn't know if you can see your family, your uncles, your aunts, and they felt like they were brought back to prisonhood in Syria, but now without their family, without their immediate members. And I loved my grandparents. I still do. My grandparents on my mother's side, we were very close to them. And so when my mother, I would see her crying in 93, like, what is she going to do? Is she going to be separated from her mother? Like her grandmother was separated from her daughter? And my grandmother and her sister didn't meet until they were 60 because of what happened earlier. And so I saw all of this, and I remember I was crying profusely night after night, just not knowing if I was going to see my grandparents or my aunts again. Until, thank God, Assad had another change of heart and he let us leave. And so the remainder just got on with their life, got on a plane and got out.
What happened to your family properties? Did you manage to sell those, or how did that happen?
So, a lot of the properties in the Jewish quarters, and this is a lot of the issues that happen. You got to remember there was 30,000 Jews around prior to 1948, and we all lived in the Jewish quarter of Syria. Now, after 1948 happened, there was about 5,000 Jews remaining. So all these properties, all these homes in the Jewish quarter were given to the Arabs that left Israel during the 48, based on the urging of their leaders. If anybody's interested, they can look up the memoirs of Khalid al-Azim. He was the prime minister of Syria from 48 and 49, in which in his memoirs on page 386, 387, he states, we've caused a great displacement of the Arab population by urging them to leave, and states it was only a matter of months between our urges for them to leave their homes and our appeal to the United Nations to resolve the refugee issue. Now, when they left, the properties that used to once belong to the Jews were given to them. And they put these new displaced immigrants, these refugees, whatever you want to call them, into the Jewish quarters. And this happened in Lebanon, this happened in Syria. And those are the populations. This is when we started really feeling the trouble. So when I left, some people were able to sell, but a lot of people left everything. The main goal was get out of Syria. We've been prisoners since 48. We couldn't leave this country. We're finally given the opportunity. So whether legally we were allowed to sell in 92, it didn't matter. We just wanted out.
So how old were you when you left?
I was about 7.5 years old.
And you remember, how did you get out? Did you fly out? How did it go?
Yes. So we flew out. I remember very distinctly getting on the plane and just sitting there, running up and down, telling my mother, I'm going to see my Aunt Rena. She was like my favorite aunt. She's the youngest of my mother's sisters. And I remember like distinctly landing in JFK, walking out, and my grandparents were there, and they had a white van at the time. We all jumped in. I was just looking out the window. I was amazed. But we came by plane.
But your first language is Arabic.
My first language is Arabic. We did try to learn Hebrew in Syria, which is a very fun way of doing it. You were allowed to pray. As a Jew, you still were allowed to pray in Syria, maybe secretly. And so the government would allow you to learn as much as you needed for actual praying. So memorize your prayers. So what we do there was one Jewish school that was in Syria. They would put the Aleph Bet inside a Sidur, or more advanced Hebrew lessons inside Sidurim or whatever, to teach us the language, to teach us Hebrew. But yeah, my first language is Arabic.
And do you have any specific memories yourself of anti-Semitism on the streets in Syria, or no? Or is it too far gone?
No, actually, that memory is what kind of sparked me to go on Instagram in the first place. I was around 3.5, 4 years old. My grandfather at the time lived in Hosh el-Basha. This was in the center of the Jewish quarters in Syria. There's a nice big courtyard outside, and there's houses surrounding this courtyard. And I would go out and play. There were stray cats all the time. I still remember my grandmother yelling at me because there was a white fridge on the first floor of her house. Make sure you close the door. The cats are going to come in and eat the meat. So I was out there. I would always play in the courtyard, play with the cats. And just one day, Palestinian mother with her child walk by. The mother urges her child, pick up a stone, throw it at this kid's head. How dare he, just sit there with a yarmulke. I think I was wearing a kippah. It wasn't that advisable back then, but whatever. They threw the stone on my head. My head break, I'm gushing blood. My mom now tells me the second part of the story. She runs immediately to the mukhabarat, to the police force that was designated to protect the Jewish community in Syria. She runs to the mukhabarat, urges them to come. They come, they see me bloodied on the floor as a 3 or 4-year-old, and an unapologetic Palestinian mother and her son standing there. They question them. Why did you do this? They gave the anti-Semitic answer: he's a Jew. The mukhabarat didn't publicly okay it, but they didn't do anything. They said, you know what? Okay, just don't do this again. Even if he's a Jew, you shouldn't assault him, right? That's not really a deterrent whatsoever. And this was commonplace. In Syria, we had no rights, no protections, and that was just one of my experiences with firsthand anti-Semitism in Syria.
It's interesting. Yeah, go on. And
I was born already when things got a little better, because prior to Assad coming into power, and not many people know this, Assad actually lifted restrictions on the Jewish people. Not all restrictions. And for somebody like my father, who was born in 52 and grew up a prior administration than Assad, to him, Assad is a savior of some sort, right? Not really, like he understands now as he left, but to him, it's, prior to 70s, before Assad came into power, we couldn't travel 10 kilometers from my house without a special visa as a Jew, without a special permit as a Jew. When Assad came, I was able to travel without that special permit, right? Now, were there still restrictions on education, what professions you're going to be? Yes. But we were beaten down so much prior to him that when there was a little lift of restrictions, the people that were actually oppressed felt like the continued oppressor was now a savior. And this is something that everybody saw was mistaken once they left. And I can tell you, I get a lot of messages that see this. They're waking up to that reality, and they woke up to that reality.
so it's interesting because my experience being more the child, the grandchild of, Sephardic Jews, was very much living within a more Ashkenazi world.
So I'm going to ask you.
What?
I wanted to ask you, as I was talking a lot, I'm like, Rob, I got to ask you something because I'm dying to know. I mean, when I came here, the first thing was people were like, oh, Jewish food, gefilte fish, matzo ball soup. How does your mom make it? And I'm looking at them like, what the hell is gefilte fish? What are you talking about? So you Sephardi, growing up in an Ashkenazi world, you learn how to cook gefilte fish. That's my first.
No, not really. Well, first, religiously, I learned how to swing both ways. Going to Bnei Akiva. My family's been in Britain for hundreds of years as Sephardi Jews, and flicking between Gibraltar and back. But my grandmother was from Morocco. My grandfather was from Gibraltar. My grandmother was from Morocco. But growing up in Manchester, there had been a larger Sephardi community that had dwindled. But realistically, by the point when I was there, many of the Sephardim Ashkenazified themselves. They, started wearing black hats. Women started wearing wigs, especially in the Orthodox communities. And I felt like I was like, we used to joke. I'd say, I'm like, there's a joke in Britain, being the only gay in the village, that when I was on school camps and they used to bring up the Holocaust, it didn't resonate with me. The closest connection I had was my great uncle, who was a prosecutor in Nuremberg. It didn't resonate with me. What resonated with me was my grandfather going, who smuggled from Morocco during the war, my grandmother who had grown up in Morocco, and those stories that came out of the change of what was, and what is, but also you talk about the food. People would come to our house and say, "Oh, wow, this is very ethnic." And we would say, "Yes, you're, we cook with garlic and spices, things that have obviously eluded you." And we would go to other people's houses, and I can remember poking through something and my mother saying, "Don't worry, Robert, it's okay." Um, but more than that, one thing I found when I sat on the Board of Deputies, which is like a British Jewish Parliament, and representing the Sephardi communities in Britain, was just really how many of the Sephardi communities were completely overlooked in terms of censuses, in terms of how they were approached by the mainstream British communities. And what they didn't understand was their narrative of the Iraqis that have been displaced, the Iranians have been displaced, the Libyan, the Sudanese. It was practically every time I approached a different, and I was very embedded with the Sephardic communities in Britain, the Bukharis, one can go on and on as to how many different Sephardi narratives, and many of these people felt, in certain regard, all of their language, the primary language was Arabic, and there were different dialects from the Egyptians to the Syrians, completely different, but the mannerisms were Arab. The way they thought was Arab. The way they thought about themselves was Arab. And they harken back to, and many of their families have been there documented for well over 1,000 years. So I've got something for you, because obviously, whilst the Palestinians have more recently been promoting the Nakba, and there's a concept the Iraqis have of the Farhud, I've got a game for you to play, right?
Let's go.
This is how many Sephardim now, how many Jews now exist in certain Arab countries, right? So and I'm going to play this, in 1948, there were 30,000 Jews in Syria. By 2018, you're from there. How many do you think were there in 2018?
In 2018, I would say I know it's probably seven or eight that I actually know of who haven't converted. I'm sure there's more that I may not know in other parts of Syria, but I know of 7 people remaining in Syria.
In 2018, there was 100. That might be less.
Yeah.
All right. I'm going to give you in Iraq, in 1948, there were 135,000 Jews.
Yeah.
In 2018, do you know how many left?
Almost nobody. It's, I think, the same, like 6 or 7 people, just random, people who just stayed behind, random stragglers. So probably 10, less than 10.
I think it's less than 10. Got it. We could play this as we go throughout. But do you know the funny thing is, and this is what I've tried to say openly, that in 1948, the Arab world was actually quite Zionistic, to the extent that the Arab world said, "Look, you've now got a country for you to go to. Could you please, a lot of you, get out and give us this pretext?"
I wish it was that nice of a question. Please get out. But yeah, I agree with you.
Now, there were 850,000 Jews displaced to Israel.
And this is a part of the story that is never told. And, there's one thing about us, especially the Syrian communities. We don't take to victimization. And if you really traced it back, it's a very Jewish trait. The survivors of the Holocaust, after the first generation, those actual survivors, especially in the first 10, 20, 30 years, didn't talk so much about the Holocaust. Part of it is the trauma. Part of it is, if you're going to keep living in that past, you are going to have a very hard time to move on into the future, because what happened in the past was so horrible and so traumatic that it can break anybody. So it's put to the side. Victim, whatever happened to you, it's put to the side, and we need to build. And so the second generation, after the first generation built, started speaking out. And you started seeing, in America at least, a real concerted effort to fight white supremacy, anti-Semitism, right? And it worked. It worked when white supremacy, anti-Semitism was the biggest threat, because the Ashkenazi Jew who had firsthand experience with white supremacy, anti-Semitism, aka the Nazis and Hitler, could come on TV and be very relatable and explain to them, explain to the world, what was the result of this anti-Semitic behavior? What was the result of this ideology? See, this Jewish, Syrian, Mizrahi, Sephardic community, many of us are still in that first phase of we just survive. We need to now thrive. And so a lot of our traumas, a lot of our pains were suppressed, put to the side. The idea that we were victims was put to the side, and it was work, build. Now, I'm lucky enough, thank God, to have parents who pushed me through education after education and really sacrificed a lot.
How did your parents make do when they came over?
A lot of there was organizations that initially helped us that were set up with the Jewish community by the Syrian Jewish community, and the UJA was I think they set up Hayas, which was also Hayas also helped us. There were organizations that got us on our feet. Once we're on our feet, the first thing my dad did was go to work. He's a tailor, go to a factory. This Syrian Jew has a factory or knows connection. Within 6 months, a year, my father had a business of his own in the United States.
As a tailor?
As a manufacturer. He opened a factory in Brooklyn, McDonald Avenue. It was his first factory, and then he moved to 3rd Avenue. He was never, he never blew it out of the park. We struggled. We didn't own a house, still rented. I still do, right? But he showed a grit. And as I grew older, I saw the appreciation. Like, this man came into this country 40-something years old, with 3 children, a pregnant wife, and he was able to feed us, right? He was able to clothe us, despite everything that would give him a reason to say, I can't. He overcame it, and maybe I didn't get the world. I didn't get a car when I never got a car from him, right? Like, I had to, he did everything in his power to help make us move along. He never said, AB, go work, help me. He said,
Sure.
Go study.
Sure, but you're a refugee. Do you consider yourself to be a refugee?
Interesting question. Yes, technically, by definition, if I didn't need to use that label today because of the twisted narrative that's being thrown around, I consider myself, when people ask me, what are you? I'm Jew. Because that's how I was called in Syria. That's how I was growing up. Yehudi. Ana Ba'arif, ana Yehudi. Khalas, right? Here we started getting different ideas. And so, am I a refugee? Technically, legal definition, maybe, right? Yes. I escaped the country seeking refuge because I was persecuted for my religion. Of course, I'd get refugee status in the United States. What I consider myself today is an American citizen. I got my citizenship. My children are not refugees. My children are full citizens of the United States of America, naturally born.
So it's not an inherited status, is it?
No, it's not. But I listen, Rob, we can talk. It's a brilliant strategy. If you look up how many displaced Palestinians there are, right? How many Palestinian refugees? Ask anybody. They go, let me go look at Google. And you look at Google and UNRWA tells you millions. Well, how could there have been millions of Palestinian refugees when the allegation of the displaced people are between 350, which is 350,000 Arabs were displaced, and that's on the low end of the estimate, to the high end of 750. So how could you create classes of millions of people as refugees? Well, it's simple. For an organization like UNRWA, who wants to perpetually exist, can change the definition of refugee. So Bella Hadid is a refugee, right?
No. That's a ridiculous extreme. I've got to take, so you may or may not know this. Before I was a lawyer, I was an archaeologist. And because my name isn't Abraham Hamra, or Jaime Mendelstein, the British government gave me a passport that just said Robert Garson on it. So I could go and excavate in Arab countries, right? So I excavated in Egypt, I excavated in Jordan, in Syria, in Lebanon, even in Gaza. I was excavating there on a joint one. And one thing I can tell you is that when I was in Jordan, the Jordanians did not, whilst even though there were millions of Palestinians there, the Jordanians did not accept the Palestinians as Jordanian. Right? They just wouldn't accept them. and treated them as second-class citizens. In Syria, the Syrians treated the Palestinians as second-class citizens. Lebanon, the same.
Yep.
When it came, Egypt has a visceral hatred for Palestinians. Is that something that you saw, encountered, understood, appreciated, or not?
Yes, because I understand what this conflict is actually about. For those who believe it's about land, this makes no sense. For those who understand that prior to Israel, forget Israel getting its sovereignty, prior to Syria getting its sovereignty, prior to Lebanon getting its sovereignty in the 40s, prior to Saudi Arabia getting its sovereignty in the 20s, or Egypt, right? All these countries were ruled under one major Islamic caliphate. And the caliphate fell. Now, there's some who have not let go of the dream of reuniting the region under one Islamic caliphate. And the some, I'll point my finger to Iran. Iran has been using these people who refer to themselves or identify themselves as Palestinians to perpetuate or to try to help them get that goal of turning into a caliphate. How do you do that? You disturb sovereign countries, whether it's Syria, whether it's Lebanon, whether it's Israel, whether it's Egypt, whether it's Jordan. You need to create a revolution, a mini revolution in each one of these countries to topple the governments. When you can do that and you can break sovereignty, the region comes back under Islamic caliphate control, and Iran is on top of the geopolitical discussion. The countries understand this. Syria saw this. Jordan understands this reality. Lebanon understands this reality. Lebanon was called the Paris. Beirut was the Paris of the Middle East. It was a majority Christian country. But you know what happened when the Iranian Revolution? Hezbollah came in. It was a change of demographic.
It was interesting. When I was in Syria in the 90s, I can remember speaking to a Syrian in the Syrian church. People don't know this. The Syrian church is actually the first church under Abgar the Great that was ever established prior to Constantine.
Yeah.
And there the Syrian church speaks Syriac, which is a form of Aramaic. And I was speaking to a Syrian priest because I was reading Siri kind of likes that. I was speaking to a Syrian priest and I said, you do realize that in 20 years' time, the only place where somebody will be able to be Christian in the Middle East will be in Israel. And he laughed at me. Sadly, that today is the actual truth.
It is.
Tell me something. Let's move forward just briefly to your Instagram journey and to now fame. Mazel tov, a few weeks ago, or a couple of weeks ago, you overcame your 20,000 follower mark. I think, you're up to 21, 22 now. Please God, your voice will become even more powerful. You started on Instagram after October the 7th, really, speaking in Arabic to the Arab world. What prompted you to do that?
So what prompted me to initially, I came onto Instagram about 2 years before that. And what prompted me was seeing Joey Borgen. If you remember, he's a kid, he was in Times Square walking around to keep broad daylight. 5 assailants brutally assault him in the middle of the street. I started watching this. My blood was boiling. And then I saw them walking out of the criminal courthouse, no bail, hailed heroes placed over their shoulders. I don't know if it was a traumatic resurfacing or whatever, but instantly I was reminded of that story, that time where I was in Syria and, a rock thrown at my head and there was no justice served. I saw a risk that was undeniable and unavoidable. If we allow this anti-Zionist, anti-Semitism to continue and to continue brainwashing and really fooling the public, we are going to face another displacement. And I wasn't ready for that. And so I just spoke out of frustration. I had 200, 300 followers, right? Mostly my friends from law school and whatnot. And all of a sudden, my account grew to 2,000. Now, I still didn't get any traction. People were like, oh, you're talking crazy. You don't know what you're talking about. Okay. October 7th happens. And I come out saying the same thing I've been saying for the last 3 years. But this time, people were able to see. The kids were hiding in basements at NYU to be chaperoned out of the building because they were afraid that the riot mobs, the anti-Zionists, were going to out to get them. What I had been saying for the last 2 to 3 years started coming true. And so people started following me, and I started making an Arabic video because I wanted to reach the Arab world. I wanted to remind them of our existence. Look, Rob, I like Arab culture. Don't get me wrong. I mean, to a certain degree, right? I like Arab music. I love Arabic music. I listen to Kulthum. I can sing you Inta Umri like you never heard it before, right? And when I was a kid in Brooklyn growing up, I used to go to Bay Ridge to the hookah bars, sit with Arabs, and till this day we connect. It just felt like we've been so divided, and that Arab world has almost forgot their relationship. The normal ones, at least, forgot the non-anti-Semites that were living in these lands. We're starting to forget their Jewish neighbors and the peacefulness of their Jewish neighbors. And we're starting to buy into this fake ideology. And so I felt the need that I need to reach out to the Arab world. I need to show them, like, look, we are not going to cower. We're not going to bend our heads for the sword. We're going to stand up for ourselves. We're going to protect ourselves. We are here and we are here to stay. Come join us.
But is that a particular mentality more of what I call the brown Jew or the Jew with the hue? Because when I was speaking in Georgetown Law the other week, and I actually took my daughter with me, my eldest, my 15-year-old, to see a self-hating Jew. And a girl stood up and she spoke and she said, I'm Jewish, but I'm anti-Zionist. I'm anti-establishment of the state of Israel. I am pro-Palestine. I believe in a free Palestine. And what you're saying is incorrect. And somebody asked me my view because she said it to another speaker and then asked me my view. And I laughed. And I said, this is one of the most Ashkenazi things I've ever heard being said. And there was silence in the room. And I said, oh, don't you know? Brown Jews and Jews with a hue in America, we don't march in pro-Palestine rallies. And do you know why? We have no white guilt. Do you think that this visceral reaction that you had is just in tune with your Sephardi background?
It's honest, and it's coming from a place of real life experience. And I'm a student of history, so it's coming from a place of experience and what I've learned in history and my education. What I think the biggest problem, especially with what I categorize as well as self-hating Jews, is they've lost touch with the roots, with who they truly are, what their traditions are. What does it mean to be a Jew, right? I'll tell you this, Rob. When I first came to the States, I was blown away by the number of Jew you can be. Right? You can be Reform, you can be conservative, you can be Orthodox, you can be modern Orthodox, you can be sushi, you can be, take your pick, right? And in Syria, in most of the Mizrahi world, there was no such thing. You were a Jew, you could have been religious, you could have been non-religious. This has nothing to do with, religious observance. As you can see, I'm not wearing a yarmulke, I don't have tzitzit, but there was something there that connected us. And so what that did when we broke away the labels, and you were Jew or not Jew, you were religious or not religious, it enabled the most religious and the least religious to come together to build one true community, but not to lie to themselves. But America, when we came, and people would ask me, what kind of Jew are you? I don't know. I'd say I'm Orthodox. They're like, yeah, you're not Orthodox. Where's your yarmulke? Well, I don't know what to tell you, right? And what I saw was a crazy phenomenon. It was a build your own Happy Meal of Judaism. And that is extremely dangerous. And I'm not talking about violating every rule. Violate every rule, if you must. But at least acknowledge, right? And I think that's where there's a responsibility, right? So I can say, I'm going to drive my car on Shabbos, for instance. So, Shabbat is how I say it. But to give an example. But I understand that driving my car on Shabbat is not allowed from the Torah whatsoever. What I saw happening in America, and continues to see happening in America, starting generations ago, people started evolving the Torah, evolving the Constitution, evolving where we got our rights, where we got our tribe, our ethnicity, our religion, and saying, you know what, maybe it's permitted. It's permitted. You can drive on Shabbat. Well, no, it's not. But when you're evolving to convenient yourself, to evade consequence, to evade personal responsibility, what you risk doing is invalidating the entire document that gave birth to you as a people. And that's what started happening. These people started losing their roots, their Jewish ancestral roots, right? Like Maaser.
So that's part of the point that I think I empathize with, not necessarily, not all of what you said, because the narrative is different. To me, I've always said there's every reason for being irreligious. There's no reason for being ignorant. And the problem is that with the, as you call it, more the pick and mix style Judaism, that it's led people not to read the core texts. And with not reading the core text, people don't necessarily understand that the vast majority of the Torah is actually, or the vast majority of the laws of the Torah are actually connected to the land of Israel. It is what gives Jews, it is their constitutional basis of their indigeneity, of saying, I am an indigenous first people to this land, that we can show the language was Hebrew. I can tell you as an archaeologist, it was, it's quite funny. Somebody quoted to me recently an Arabic rap song that said, dig underneath Al-Aqsa and you'll find us. No. As an archaeologist, I can tell you, for what hasn't been destroyed and thrown out the side in a dump, dig underneath anywhere in Israel until you get to the early Bronze period of about, 3000 BC, that you'll find early Proto-Hebraic scripts, everything there from an archaeological perspective, if not Roman and Greek, but still mixed in, is a connection of Jews to the land. And I find that what the Ashkenazim or those people that haven't read the text have lost is the fact that Jews, whilst being displaced, are indigenous to that land. And therefore, coming back to that land is exactly the same as Aborigines being given back rights to that land, Native Americans being given rights back to their land, Maoris being given rights back to their land, Africans being given rights back to their land after what was prolonged periods of colonization. I think that's where I think that disconnects from the Torah and those later writings, and even those later writings where you see Rambam writing back to the communities, in Safat and Jericho, etc. The texts are there to show. That's what I found to be the case.
Yeah, I mean, like you were saying, the Torah is intrinsic to the land of Israel. There's one rule, one commandment, which is giving 10% to charity. That's what all the Americans know. There's a commandment, you give 10% to charity. That's not the rule. The rule is ma'asid. And the only way it comes in effect is if actually you are in Israel, and it's not about cash or dollars. It's about your harvest. You couldn't fulfill this commandment without it. So I'll tell you, I pray, I put on tefillin. And so one of my Arabic videos, I put on my tefillin and I said, look, one of the prayers we say, and I said in the tefillin that I wore, that my great grandfather wore to Moses, is lema'an yirbu yemechem, and I'll translate, v'imei benechem al ha'adama asher nishba Adonai l'avotechem, right? For your days shall be long on the land that God promised to your lands. Whatever God promised, didn't promise. At the end of the day, this text has been read by us even prior to the creation of Islam. This text is found in the Old Testament itself.
So let me ask you this. How do your Arab followers, if any, how have they related to you? How much hate have you received? Do you need to, have an armed guard posted outside your house? What's been the reaction to you?
So the more Americanized Arab community, the more woke community, and I'm sorry if I offend anybody with that usage of the word, but that's how it's the best description I have. More woke communities have been very derogative to me in their communication. And you'd expect that. However,
but you have any Arabs from the Arab world following you?
Yes. The Arabs from the Arab world understand. And you know what? I'm going to read, if I can find it real quick, one message. Somebody wrote to me from Lebanon. Hi, I'm a Lebanese, Muslim. I grew up in the town of Sidon. I know there were Jews around us. I've immigrated to Canada since. I just wanted to reach out and apologize for what we've done to you. There's another guy that reached out to me, and he's from Syria, from my community in Syria, knew exactly where I was talking about, where I was assaulted in Hosh al-Basha. And that's a voice note. And I just want to play it for everybody because I truly think it's in English. Part of it's in English, and that's a relevant part. It tells a real story. So let me just play this real quick.
بعرف وين حوش الباشا.
I know where Hosh al-Basha.
سوريا. طلعت من سوريا. I was 17 years old. بعد الهاي سكول درست بسايبرس وبعدين جيت على أمريكا هون بجورجيا. Man, it's crazy how we've been brainwashed in Syria growing up. Like when you leave the country, you see things like shit. Like how did we think like that? Like, man, it's crazy عن جد يعني. واللي صار بأكتوبر 7 طبعا أنا half of my friends they don't talk to me anymore because of my views and stuff, and it's barbaric. It's horrible, man. It's inhumane. And
the more real Arabs that actually lived in that region understand what this fight is. They understand it's not about land, if they're being honest with you. And I've had very honest conversations. I've had more love from them than I've had, I'll be very honest, from the Jewish Voices or Peace group or whatever they call themselves. Where they're attacking me, and they've attacked me a lot. Messages, I'm a Jew, for peace, you're not a real Jew, which I find ironic because then I ask them, I tell them, listen, your whole entire pro-Palestinian rallies are saying that European Jews are not Jews. You guys, Jews for Peace, consistently make up of European Jews. I don't believe that. I don't subscribe to that. I see you as a real Jew. However, you're subscribing to their ideology. So how dare you come at me, a brown Jew, if you want to play this game of victim, victimizer, oppressor, oppressed, how dare you come at me, who you and your pro-Palestinians consider a real Jew, and debate what Jews should and should not believe in.
Hold on. Are people trying to define your identity for you?
Oh, all the time. You're not really Syrian. You're not really born in Syria. You may be Jewish. You need to wake up. It's Zionism that caused the problem. There was peace in the Middle East before 1948. Really? The Grand Mufti of Jerusalem met one-on-one with Hitler. The Grand Mufti of Jerusalem took a Nazi corroborator and introduced him to Rashid Ali, who was fully responsible to the coup in Iraq that led to the expulsion of the Farhud and the expulsion of the Iraqi Jews. So
look. One of the thing I can tell you. So I've been doing some recent research into mutilation in the context of sexual crimes, because I used to be a criminal barrister in Britain, and when I saw what had happened in Israel, I spoke to many lawyers about whether or not they'd encountered mutilations, and the answer was no. So it sent me on a kind of quest of research because it didn't seem, I know sexual crime isn't natural, so to speak, but whether or not mutilation was normally accompanied sexual crime. And on the whole, I found it didn't at all. However, there were occasions where I saw these mutilations. In 1929 in Hebron, in 1929 in Akko, 1929 in Safat, 1929 in Tiberias, also in Libya. There was a pogrom in 1934. So one starts. We also see it in the Kenya, the Westgate Mall massacre that occurred in I think it was 2008. I'm sorry if I've got that wrong. But one thing I saw was that, when people say, oh, everything was wonderful, that's not quite correct. We see massacres, but coupled with this horrific sexual mutilation, which makes me think it was actually taught. It was taught to people. This is what you do along the way.
Right. Remember, so there's two things I want to say real quick on this, because you're 100% right. One is I sent you a picture on my last journey to Israel. I went to places where people told me not to go, right? I went to a village called Silwan. This is a very hotly contested village in the East Jerusalem. And the Arabs make claims that their great-great-grandparents used to live there until these damn Jews came around. Now, I got my hands on a letter that was written by the British government at the time, urging the Jewish community of Silwan to evacuate Silwan due to the riots, the Arab riots and pogroms that were taking place, and that they will help bring them back as refugees and cover their expenses. Now,
what year was that letter?
That letter was written in the year 1938, 10 years before the state of Israel. Now, I go, what are you talking about? I thought Silwan was an Arab stronghold. I'll be honest, I didn't even know. Silwan is really called Kfar HaTemani, which is the Yemenite village, or Shiloh. It was occupied, it was set up, the first time it was set up, it was established as a town, was in the year 1882 by the Yemenite Jewish community, who did face discrimination from the Ashkenazi Jews and from Arabs as well. And so they set up this village. That's where they lived, and they had to flee their homes. Nobody asked for their rights, and now nobody knows this piece of history. If you go to Silwan, you see eyes painted in buildings. Ask yourself, why are these eyes there? I thought it was the Ein Hara, right? The evil eye. But what I later come to learn, it's an EU commissioned painting with an Arab organization that's intended to send a strong signal. Jews were watching you. Don't come back. Arabs were watching you as well. Don't sell to Jews.
But that Kfar HaTemani, that was set up really because of what may have been Ottoman Jewish and Ashkenazi Jewish racism against the Temani Jews.
Yes.
They didn't want them living
of course.
Them.
Yes, that is true. And we need to take a hold of that and be accountable to that. It happened. That's the truth. There was discrimination early on, of course. It doesn't mean that things haven't changed. It doesn't mean that Israel didn't experience a Black Panther movement. They did. You know who the Black Panthers in Israel were? The Mizrahim, right? There were fights for civil rights, but that's the beauty of a democracy. We were people that were separated between Europe and the Middle East for 1,000 years. It is a miracle that we've bound together only in 100 years.
Well, there's one thing I actually said when I was speaking recently. I said, Israel, and I say it in the context of the Ethiopian Jews, who are not brown Jews, they're black Jews. And that I say Israel is one of the, I think, the only Western democracy to go to Africa to take Africans and absorb them in order to save them and not enslave them, and to marry Ethiopian Jews and to bring them in as part of their communities. And it's something which I think is deeply beautiful in Israel.
I take pride in that. I truly take pride in that. I mean, look, you were talking about mutilation as well just a minute ago. I just wanted to tell you this one story that I think shows a pattern. There were 4 women who tried to escape Syria when it was illegal for Jews to immigrate out of Syria. So the way they left was through escaping, running to Israel, being smuggled. There were 4 girls that were trying to leave Syria in the 1974. 3 of them were sisters, 1 was their friend. These young ladies were caught trying to flee. They were raped. They were brutally murdered. They were slaughtered, dismembered, placed in body bags, and they dropped them off at the doorsteps of their parents to send a very clear signal to the Jews. Don't you think of running away. Sexual crime, sexual mutilation is big in that part of the world because sex isn't what me and you and regular Americans understand sex to be in that part of the world. It's not. It's about a power dynamic. And it's about humiliation, right? So if they raped you, they've stained your family, right? In this warped way. And that's why they have honor killings, right? So sometimes if your daughter, as an Arab man, and my mother actually had a friend who was murdered by her family in Syria. How dare you go to a nightclub, go with this? I mean, that sex is very closely related to honor. And the only way they can beat you is through honor, right? Is through destroying your honor, destroying your pride. And so that's why sexual crimes, especially sexual mutilation, took on such a big part in the Middle East, especially crimes against women and Jews.
So it's funny because it's more, and just to say, people do have, we can run over a little bit, depending upon Abraham, if you wish to. If people have questions, I see Eddie has raised a hand. If you want to ask a question, we do always review them before, and please place it into a chat that's so we can see that. It's funny because a lot of if I were going to say, the anti-Semitism that I received when I was growing up in Britain, a lot of it came from the white intelligentsia. You know, I can remember Judge saying to me, Mr. Garson, are we going to have one of your Talmudic questions today? And I'd say, my lord, I apologize. You're going to have to think today. And I know that's going to trouble you. But what's interesting, a lot of if we're going to call it racism that I received on the street, wasn't on account of being Jewish most of the time, because I didn't walk around the streets of Manchester with a kippah on. It was because of my coloring. I was, I am Hewish, as I'm going to call it. And so, especially from the white Anglo-Saxon in Britain, I got spat on being called a Pakistani or an Indian or this, but realistically, I could fit in anywhere. So, but one thing you were always, even growing up in my environment, I kind of fitted in nowhere. Within the Jews, I was, the little dark boy in the corner, but said a little tongue in cheek, because my grandfather was El Rubio, he's a redhead from Gibraltar. But then on the other side, the people who were not Jewish saw me more by the color of a skin tone rather than the color of rather than a kippah on my head. So you kind of got it every which way.
And I end this on a positive note. If I can just say one thing that's gonna move away a little bit, and then we can take questions. But your family, my family, myself, we've been through hell. I could say I was victimized. That is true. But I think it's immensely important, especially to teach children, especially minorities, especially people who have been immigrants, is a trait of resiliency. When I came in, and I'm not saying I'm the greatest, but I didn't have excuses. I didn't have the privilege of making excuses. My dad told me very straight, you speak English. The sky is the limit. He didn't tell me about all my trauma and all my problems I'm gonna have and my name and all this stuff. I've changed my name. My name was Ibrahim Abu Hamra. It changed to Abraham Hamra because after a year of going to court, the court reporter would continue asking me to spell Ibrahim Abu Hamra. And I'm like, this is turning into a spelling bee. There's so many letters involved. So I changed it to Abraham Hamra. And the idea was I never thought, why didn't I get an interview when I didn't get an interview out of law school? And I graduated cum laude in top of my class. What's going on? Is it my name being Ibrahim Abu Hamra that caused the barrier? I don't care. It didn't matter. I had focus. I needed to succeed in this new country. I needed to succeed to make sure my children have a future. So everything went to the side. I didn't get a job. Great. Start my own business. That's what my dad told me. What are you doing at home? Start your own business. I started my own law firm. I worked. I love litigation. That was my true desire, my true love. I built a great litigation practice. Thank God I sold, and I have a beautiful immigration practice now. But the idea is, I don't live in my past. And I don't think we should start teaching children to continue living by their past. We need to move past our victimization, try to be empowered and empower others to believe in themselves. And I think that's crucially missing in today's time.
Yeah, it's that's that's your narrative, that's your experience. Please God, your practice will expand ever further. Hopefully down to Florida. I consider myself a refugee from New York down to Florida. We will welcome you down here. Alyssa, have you received any questions?
I have two questions. Yes, I have one from Jason and one from Eddie. I'll start. Jason messaged a while back, so I'll just start there. And to both of you, he asked, hearing the stories of the Ashkenazic and Sephardic perspectives of Jewish heritage today, what advice would you give to help reconnect those that have shifted away from Zionism or consider themselves anti-Zionist? And he also wants to know from Rob what the Georgetown student's response to you was. So I guess that's
So I could, my answer is, look, I can't tell people how to think. I can only tell people how to experience and how to educate themselves. What I would say is, go to Israel if you haven't been. Go and experience it for yourself, and also go to the Arab countries if you can. Not that I would tell someone to go to Gaza nowadays. I worked in Gaza in the 90s. It was okay for me to go at the time, that's for sure. Because I was male, I could sit down, smoke a few Cleopatras, and play shesh-besh with some guys. A Western white woman wouldn't have been able to go at that time. But go and sit down and speak to as many people as you can and get proper perspectives and debate. The problem is people nowadays they don't listen anymore to other people. They don't debate. They only shout at other people. So that's what I would suggest those people to do. And the second part of the question was, what was the answer? Silence. I'm not sure the person was listening. Because people nowadays, and I do believe it's a social media problem, people aren't geared to accept and challenge their own views. I oftentimes say, you know what, you might be right.
And if I can just contribute, I agree, but I just contribute one more thing is to the first part of that question, obviously. I think those people haven't really met Mizrahi Jews, Sephardic Jews. A lot of them are very undereducated, are falling for the argument that these are brown, these are white, these are oppressed, these are oppressors, and they don't have a community connection with the Mizrahi world. And so, as I was saying earlier, when it was white supremacy, the Ashkenazi Jews came on TV and they fought it because they said, look, this would happen to us because of this ideology, the Holocaust happened. I think nowadays, to really fight back against this, we need to amplify Mizrahi voices. We need to get them on the news channel. Instead of, and I have nothing against Mr. Greenblatt from the ADL, God bless him, but it's just, we're lawyers, right? You don't need to face two issues when you can stipulate one issue out. He comes, he's white, he's European, he's Jewish 100%, and I believe that, and he's roots there, but he has two issues to convince the audience. One, of his roots, and he's going to have to go back to the time of the temple and the displacement. They've lost you. And then the actual issue. I think when you bring a Mizrahi or a Sephardic Jew to the table, to the interview, that first part melts away. I don't have to prove my heritage or my roots within the Middle East. That's where I was born. That's where my great-grandparents were from, right? And so I think further amplifying our voice, you get the other people, the anti-Zionists out there, the ones who don't necessarily, you get them to hear our perspective. You get to break the ideology that they are relying on to justify their conclusion of their, logical belief.
Or illogical.
Illogical belief, yeah.
And I can't hear you. Alyssa. Thank you.
yes. So Eddie has some questions or comments about Ethiopian Jews that he wants to discuss. Maybe I'll unmute him so that Eddie, if you want to ask
Sure.
Cameron Rob.
So can you hear me?
Yes.
Everybody can hear.
So I had been involved in Soviet Jewry emigration as well as Ethiopian Jewry emigration starting in the 1970s. And I can say how challenging it was to get Ethiopian Jews in. Israel didn't want them. It wasn't until 1977 that Shamir acknowledged that Ethiopians were even Jews. Back in the day of Haile Selassie, any Ethiopian could get a visa to Israel except for Jews because there was a fear that Jews would stay. And I can also tell you the challenges we had in when we were moving Jews from Gondar to Sudan. The Israelis were not very cooperative. It was actually Vice President George H.W. Bush who was helping to get the Jews from Sudan to Israel. And I know quite a few Ethiopian Jews in Israel now who still feel, whether it's the two killings or other examples of racism in Israel directed to them, where they don't feel equal to Ashkenazi Jews, especially, and have consistently, and also that there are still Jews in Gondar now who want to go to Israel, and Israel sets up a different standard for Jews in Ethiopia compared to Ashkenazi Jews in the rest of the world.
There is no doubt that there are imperfections within any given system. And one thing I can tell you is because it was my great uncle's father-in-law, Lord Alliance, who was one of the main funders of Operation Moses. He's an Iranian Jew himself from Kashan, who then came to Britain, built up one of the largest textile empires in the world, and then was one of the main funders behind Operation Moses, Operation Solomon at a later date. Nobody's saying that Israel's perfect.
And if I can just add to that, I think, and what I was trying to go before, I think it's quite remarkable to see where we are today. We were discommunicated. We were in a diaspora, and we still technically are, right? And in Syria, I didn't know Jews in Europe. And in Europe, they didn't know Jews who lived in Syria or Ethiopia. I never knew there were Jews that lived in Ethiopia. We all kind of started finding ourselves, right? In the 1800s, in Israel's reestablishment, and there was the honest hostilities. I mean, look, the way I grew up, I eat rice on Passover, right? The Ashkenazi community doesn't eat rice on Passover. What's authentic Judaism? What's not authentic Judaism? Who's a Jew? Who's not a Jew? These are human emotions that in a book don't exist, but in real life, they exist. Now, as I was saying, what was beautiful about this is if you look now and today, is there still instances of racism? Of course, and it exists everywhere in the world. However, you're seeing a Jewish community that no time in the past 100 years knew each other. My mother never knew Black Jews existed. My mother didn't know white Jews existed in Europe, right? Now we're together, they're in touch. There's imperfections in the system. You fight every single discrimination or racism you see, and you try to make the system better. But the Ethiopian Jews that I know, and I'll be very honest with you, are very Zionistic. There's Black Jewish Magic. She speaks out on Instagram. There's Lilac. There's a ton of Ethiopian outspoken activists for Israel that are really centering and getting a ton of spotlight in the discussion. And one of an Ethiopian Jewish refugees who served in the IDF is actually running for Congress in the 3rd District of New York, and she is extremely Zionist. So to look at her and say, well, you may not believe they're you may be dismissing their discrimination. No, she understands what happened. I understand how the Mizrahis were discriminated against, but guess what? The Mizrahis also discriminated. We didn't have the power, but we also discriminated against Ashkenazim. They're not real Jews. Listen, my mother would have lost her mind if she knew I was going to marry half an Ashkenaz girl, when we were in Syria. How do you know? Maybe they intermarried in Russia or in Germany. These are human fears because we wanted to keep the religion together.
What do you mean?
We wanted to keep our identity.
Even within the Sephardi world, there was a very famous case in the 1880s between what they called the Sephardim in northern Morocco and the Forasteros, who were from places like Marrakesh, where the first marriage between the two of them, between the Aboutboul family and the Levi family occurred. And it was a massive scandal.
Listen,
but there's that.
Even Bibi came up and said, you guys made peace between the Shamis and the Halabis. These are two towns in Syria, Aleppo and Damascus. We were always at it. If you can make peace with them, you can make peace with anybody. We're uniting, and there's growing pains with unity.
We've got to cut off. I'd like to say two things. Number one, first and foremost, I have to thank you for putting yourself out on Instagram, because had that not been the case, I wouldn't have contacted you. And Joey Cohen put us together, and I'd like to thank him for that. Secondly, I find what is, a slightly younger, better-looking brother and I feel deeply connected to you in the short times that we've had together, and I hope there'll be many more. I would like to, you're now, you're a member of the AAJLJ. I would like to have you back to bring maybe some of your Instagram friends and do what I'm doing with you, you doing with them, for the AAJLJ, and carry on doing what you're doing. The fight for truth and for relevance is important, and the time that you put into it, you're not compensated for it. You're doing it for the good of community, for the good of humanity, and on a personal level, and for the good of the law. You bring dignity to the profession.
Thank
You bring dignity to the community. You bring dignity to your family, and hopefully the world will regain its dignity in good order.
Robert, thank you so much. And I truly do consider you a brother. We found each other. It's amazing. We come from the same region, but we had completely separate experiences and different experiences. And I am very excited to be a part of the JLJ, and really moving forward with this. Thank you.
Thank you to both of you. And I'm going to ask one more question before we sign off.
Sure.
I'm going to put your Instagram handle in the chat, Abraham.
Okay, not a problem. Abraham Hamra. I use my name. I know it's crazy. People are
Abraham
like,
Hamra.
boycotted.
That's it. Okay.
They let them
Ibrahim Hamra, shukran, وجعل مع السلامة.
Really appreciate this. Thank you everybody for coming and hearing ours out. Truly appreciate it.
All right. Thank you to everybody. And there will be a recording that we'll distribute. So goodbye to everybody. And thank you to Abraham and Rob. Take care. Bye-bye.